Hello, everyone. Welcome. My name is Justin Ayala. On behalf of Students for Sensible Drug Policy, I'm thrilled to announce the beginning of our inaugural Summer Psychedelic Symposium. I'm streaming to you all from the traditional and unceded land of the Miwok and Nisenan people, otherwise known as Sacramento, California. I want to take a moment to acknowledge the land that we all reside on, and also the fact that psychedelics are rooted in an ongoing Indigenous history that we all must honor. I want to thank anyone here who commits to the ongoing process of learning and unlearning that is so important to this work. If you feel called to, you can find more resources related to this in our link tree, which you can find in our chat. We are all so excited to have a set of inspiring and accomplished speakers presenting today on topics related to psychedelic policy, corporate practice, therapy, and research. My team and I thank you for taking the time out of your schedule to join us today. We acknowledge that by bringing your hearts and your intellect to the space, you are all contributing to an exciting shift in how society relates to a very powerful set of plants, fungi, and synthetic compounds. Before we get started, I want to briefly talk about what Students for Sensible Drug Policy is, explore some of our event's core themes, and give a brief overview of our agenda. SSDP prides itself on being a student-led organization that empowers individuals to find and enact alternatives to the war on drugs. Our strategies include public education, harm reduction practices, and policy work. SSDP was started in 1996, and now, 26 years later, SSDP is present in more than 300 campuses in 32 different countries. SSDP chapters across the world routinely champion for life-saving policy change on campuses within local government and nationwide, as well as internationally. In addition, SSDP regularly funds and supports young individuals who would like to get involved in various careers. For those interested, individuals can always apply to start a local chapter or join an already existing one. More information will be available in the SSDP link tree, as well as at the end of today's symposium. Today's symposium comes in the wake of an unprecedented last few years in the arena of psychedelic research, therapy, and decriminalization. With the passage of Oregon's Measure 109 and the decriminalization of psilocybin and other psychedelics in cities such as Denver, Oakland, Santa Cruz, Washington, D.C., and others, important questions had to be asked. Questions such as, what should the future of psychedelic usage look like? How can we ensure equitable access to training and treatment? How do we ethically manage the production and administration of psychedelic substances? Today's symposium will cover topics such as these, and many others. In order to properly discuss such nuanced topics, we feel it is important to define some of today's core themes. Those themes are equity and equality. Equality is defined as the state or quality of being equal in quantity, degree, value, rank, or ability. Equity, on the other hand, is defined as the quality of being fair or impartial, or something that is fair and just. Equity attempts to provide the resources an individual needs to succeed based on each individual's unique needs, rather than attempting to make the outcome equal across the board. So you're probably wondering, what does this mean within the realm of psychedelics? Generally, psychedelics have become more accessible and have enjoyed broader acceptance over the last few years. Despite this, individuals from marginalized communities or low-income backgrounds remain underrepresented in the leadership of emerging psychedelic companies, research laboratories, clinical trials, and generally experience barriers to accessing the benefits of these substances. From a provider standpoint, this may be a call to balance the need for licensed training of providers with the financial and time constraints restraints of a diverse population. In addition, it may mean codifying continued ability for indigenous populations to practice their traditions in the way that they have for thousands of years. Frankly, there are a plethora of other dilemmas within this field that must be addressed as we build an equitable and ethical framework. It will take continuing discourse and action to address the challenges related to this field. This moment is a call for individuals of all walks of life to rise up to the challenge of co-creating a just psychedelic future. We hope today's symposium provides an important platform for learning, for communication, and for continued involvement as you engage with this ever-expanding and exciting field. Today, we're joined by Dr. Vilmarie Fraguada Narloch, Steven Huang, Senator Scott Wiener, and Dr. Rick Strassman. These accomplished speakers are truly leaders in their respective fields. It is my honor to introduce my colleague Anousheh Bakhti-Suroosh, who will be moderating today's event. Take it away, Anousheh.
Thank you, Justin, for getting us started with that thoughtful introduction. And thank you all for being here today. My name is Anousheh Bakhti-Suroosh, and I will be moderating today's symposium. I'm co-president and co-founder of the SSDP chapter at the University of California, San Diego. And I'm a neurosciences PhD student in the lab of K-Tai at the Salk Institute. My thesis work aims to understand how psychedelics impact neural representations of emotion. So I'm incredibly excited to be here today to hear from leaders in psychedelic therapy, accessibility, policy, and research in today's discussion. Throughout the symposium, please feel free to submit questions for the speakers using the QR code behind me or the link posted in the chat. After each speaker, there will be a 15 to 20 minute moderated discussion. Our team will monitor questions submitted during the presentation and the Q&A to pose during this moderated portion. So please don't hesitate to submit your questions at any point. So moving right in, I'm honored to introduce our first speaker, Dr. Vilmarie Fraguada Narloch. Dr. Narloch is a licensed clinical psychologist in Chicago, Illinois, and a harm reductionist working to end the war on drugs. She received her certificate in psychedelic-assisted therapy and research from the California Institute of Integral Studies in 2018, and is the former director of drug education at SSDP from 2016 to 2022. She's the co-founder and director of Sana Healing Collective, a Chicago-based nonprofit organization committed to individualized, client-led approaches that promote the well-being of the whole person and community, with a focus on psychedelic-assisted therapies. She supports the decriminalization of all drugs and strives to increase racial diversity in the psychedelic field. Dr. Narloch also advised on the new education program entitled Psychedelic Fundamentals, created by MAPS, which is the Multidisciplinary Association for Psychedelic Studies. Dr. Narloch is a featured speaker in this introductory course, which aims to guide newcomers through the basics of psychedelics. So, presenting Navigating the Benefits and Risks of Psychedelic Therapy, please help me welcome Dr. Vilmarie Narloch.
Hello, thank you so much, everyone. Thank you. I want to give a specific shout out and thanks to Jackie, a fellow Latina in this space, who personally invited me to attend, and I know did a lot of the behind the scenes work to make this happen. So thank you, Jackie. And yeah, so I am presenting today it's a session, a workshop, a something that I developed with my dear friend, Irina Alexander, who's also a SSDP alum and also a psychedelic therapist. This is a very important and exciting collaboration between Sana Healing Collective and Sage Institute, which are two nonprofits in this space doing clinical work. And you know, when we're in this time of like lots of money funneling into the space for like drug development and lots of venture capitalists, those of us at the bottom kind of like don't always see those funds, so we have to lift each other up and collaborate in these interesting and unique ways. So this will be a very sort of slimmed down, streamlined version of this presentation, but it'll give you a little bit of a taste of the sorts of things that are important to us as we sort of navigate this space and working with people individually. And hopefully gives you a little bit of an idea of how we, instead of work to exclude people from the work, try to sort of assess people in and kind of beef up their resources, address any barriers they might have to accessing these services. So I'm going to kind of breeze through a lot of stuff because there's definitely a lot more content in here than I am allotted in my time. But hopefully it'll give you a taste. And yes, it's definitely a simplified version of something that is, quite complex. So just to give you that disclaimer from the get-go. And yeah, there'll be time for questions at the end. And I'm going to share my screen here. So this is a brief version of the navigating the benefits and risks of psychedelic therapy. So this is definitely going to be more of a clinical focus. And if you're interested in seeing the entire version of this or the evolution of it, because it's definitely going to be a continual work in progress, Irina and I will be presenting the full version of this in San Juan, Puerto Rico at the Harm Reduction Conference coming up this fall in my home island of Puerto Rico. I'm very excited about that. So I do have a little intro page. I want to, highlight Irina as well in the work for this. But for my sake, to expand on the beautiful intro that was shared earlier, I think the most important part of this is that I'm a Puerto Rican cat lady without any actual cats. The rest you kind of got in the other introduction. All right, so this is sort of what this covers. So talking about some of the risks of psychedelic use, the risks that might be involved in psychedelic therapy, some of the benefits, and how do we sort of, essentially navigate when it's worth, taking some of these risks. So first of all, when we're working with any individual in the clinical space and trying to weigh out, if someone might be a good candidate, if psychedelic therapy, if ketamine therapy, which is what we both do at Sage and Sana right now, which is what's legal to us, if that's going to be something that's going to be beneficial for someone, if they're going to be a good candidate for that with that particular clinician. So there's lots of different things that may be considered risks to consider in collaboration with that client, with that person. Some of these are things to maybe be prepared for and have the training and capacity to work with as a clinician, more so than being like actual risks or things that you would say like, oh, if that person has this thing, we can't work with them, right? It's more about sort of figuring out, weighing the options, weighing your own skill set against sort of what's coming up. And there are things that if they're maybe mishandled with, whether it's the wrong therapist, whether it's the wrong training, it could cause harm. So some things to consider there include any sort of medical risks, trauma, flashbacks, or processing. So that's one where like, that's not a risk. Most of the people that come to this work have some sort of trauma. I'd venture to say most of anyone anywhere has experienced some sort of trauma these days. So that's more of one of those things that you might want to just have the skill set to address with that person and like make sure that you know how to handle trauma, that you have skills and training in that. Same with suicidal, homicidal ideation. If you're a therapist, you come across this, it's what, part of the work, part of the tools that we have that we need to learn how to work with. When it comes to psychedelics, all of these things can be heightened, enhanced, right? We're dealing with power tools here, so extra finesse, extra care is needed for these sorts of things. And you can see some of the other things. Some, obviously our body contains multitudes, and a lot of that can come up in any sort of session, whether it's regular therapy, but particularly in psychedelic therapy. So working with that with the person can be useful as well. Another thing that I think we don't really talk a lot about, but I see it a lot in my clients too, is sort of like the backlash or the sort of like after effects of having a session. So maybe you have like a really wonderful ketamine session. The person, like afterwards, like they're no longer feeling depression, they're no longer feeling anxiety. It feels like the magic pill that they've been seeking out. But then as the sort of afterglow wears off, they might crash, you know, hard, because their defenses are coming back online, you know, their sort of like default patterning is coming back online. And without proper preparation, without having the conversation of that possibly happening, that can lead to people feeling really defeated, as if it's not going to work for them, as you know, this was sort of like their last ditch effort and it didn't work. And you can imagine how challenging that can be to address. So a lot of preparation goes into having those conversations of what to expect. And, you know, we are being bombarded by all sorts of pharma type ads, news stories, headlines, making possibly inflated claims about the cures and promoting all sorts of psychedelic products. And, you know, kind of have to question a little bit some of the safety, some of the ethics around these claims. And this is what people seeking this kind of therapy come into my office in their heads with, right? Like, this is the cure, this is going to fix everything. And so, you know, a lot of the preparation is sort of like unlearning and undoing some of these effects of the sort of media bombardment of psychedelics. And of course, you know, there's all sorts of things that we see, and there's also a lot of harm that's been happening in the space, you know, historically. And so there's also a lot that we have to do to address the ethics of that and the safety of our clients and people in our community that are going to go out and seek experiences, and making sure that, you know, it's our responsibility as people in the space to educate folks on that as much as possible. You know, there's possible boundary crossing, abuse, coercion, consent violations, physical, sexual, romantic boundary crossings that are really serious. And we really need to make sure that folks are aware of that, and knowing how to ask the right questions, you know, vet people correctly, all that kind of stuff, which for folks who are just sort of dipping their toes into it might not have the scope of understanding of this space that some of us have. So kind of being that, you know, holding some people's hands through that, or pointing them to the right resources so they know some of those questions to ask. So what are some of the risks associated with having a therapist present, right? A lot of people think that, you know, having a therapist present is like the best thing to mitigate risk of harm when using psychedelics. And in a lot of cases, maybe most cases, that might be true, but that might not be for everyone. You know, we are dealing with individual people, individual history and experience. And, you know, bringing another person into the room can, you know, possibly include some risks, right? So abuse of power, manipulation, all those things that I mentioned earlier, this intimacy vulnerability or hangover. So if someone is in an altered state and either they behave in a certain way or share something that maybe is really personal or private, that afterwards, once they sort of come back into this realm, feel a lot of shame or embarrassment or whatever of having shared that, that can be you know, a problem between the therapist, right? That sort of therapeutic relationship may be impacted negatively by that. Of course, projection, countertransference, transference, all of those psychological possibilities when you're dealing with interpersonal relations. Again, not necessarily something that is something to avoid, but rather something to have the skill set and tools to be able to address, right? There's also the risk of a therapist sort of guiding into an inappropriate experience or like kind of pushing them further into the trauma without having like proper preparation and sort of like things like that. So a lot of this has to do with like unskilled guides or therapists in this realm. And then of course there's benefits, right? With a therapist, there's, the act of just like physically setting the safety of the space, setting boundaries, creating that optimal setting, the chance for clients to go deeper into their experience because they feel that safety of having someone else present, that they're not alone going through what might be a challenging experience. In the research, a lot of it shows that the treatment can be more effective and more efficient. In other words, you may only need like a couple of sessions to address whatever it is you're coming in to address versus like multiple sessions if you're doing it on your own. Having the preparation and the integration and all of that support from a therapist or a skilled guide or sitter that works with you throughout that whole process can kind of, it's kind of like bumping it up a little bit, right? It gives you a bit of a beneficial edge there. And any of the therapist's own sort of skills and tools and education and expertise that can be enhancing, whether that's body work or somatic experiencing or EMDR or whatever their particular skill set is, meditation, internal family systems, all these things that can be really beneficial adjuncts to this work can be, again, further enhance the process. So those are just some of the highlights I would say. Oh, another one I think that's a big one is having emotionally reparative experiences can be really beneficial. So that's basically, if someone has had a relational trauma, whether it's, abandonment or neglect or something like this from a parent or other trusted person, that to be able to have an experience where maybe it sort of parallels or mimics the kinds of patterns that they had with that person, and the therapist, through their skills, through the relationship that they have with that client, is able to either help them work through, help them break that pattern, help them, serve as the support that they were missing at that particular time, can be really reparative emotionally and sort of help the person process or move through whatever that experience was that caused them to be stuck in that. So how do we figure out like what's worth the risk? Everybody's different. Everyone has different life circumstances. The set and setting are going to be unique to that individual. So there's no one way to define this safety, right? The client is the expert in their own lived experience. I think a lot of therapists forget that. But you also have clinical lived experience that you can offer. So it's really a collaboration. And consulting with peers, consulting with supervisors to get support, to sort of work through any other things is also really important. So I mentioned the phrase assessing in earlier, and that's really, addressing whatever barriers they might have by focusing on their strengths, getting creative while being, realistic when we're dealing with those risks. So in other words, instead of saying, no, you're not a good fit, thinking first about what other ways, what other things you can offer, what other suggestions there may be, that might be slowing down the process. So maybe you have a particular protocol that you follow, but it's going to be a different protocol for this client because you need to slow down. Maybe that means more preparation sessions. Maybe it means getting them set up with other services that can be, kind of setting up a support system for them to focus on that safety. And it's a little bit of, psychedelic social work. So working with them to get their basic needs met, to make this a possibility for them. And of course, collaboration is key to that. So I do have a handout that I can share after I'm done sharing my screen, that kind of walks you through this. So I'll share that in a little bit, but I'll kind of move forward from here. Okay, so a lot of harm reductionists sort of like to think through things in this drug setting and sort of framework. It's really helpful for me. I find it, clients find it really useful too, because it's a nice sort of like visual as well as like simple breakdown of the things to consider. So of course, drug, we kind of know what we're dealing with here, right? We're talking about psychedelics. And there's lots of different factors that you're going to consider as far as dosing, as far as like source, legality, all that kind of stuff. And when it comes to the therapeutic context, the set is, of course, the person, the individual, the client, and what they kind of bring into the session. So we look at like their goals and intentions, right? Are they coming in here thinking this is their silver bullet, magic pill kind of expectation? So wanting to work with them to intentionally sort of lower those expectations and think of it more realistically, collaborating with them to come up with those realistic goals or intentions that incorporates their current environment, their current situation. And oftentimes you may need to do some education around setting intention, what that means, and what are sort of useful ways that you can work on an intention or simplify something based on where the client is at. Oftentimes thinking of things through the concept of stages of change can be really useful. So if it's a person who is someone who uses drugs, for example, and maybe that's something that they're wanting to work on in the process, thinking about it through that can be a useful thing. So where they are at in their stage of change is part of that set. This also includes their spiritual, religious belief systems or sort of social belief systems. Talking about the inner healing intelligence is really useful in this consideration. Reminding that this is psychedelic assisted therapy, right? The drug is part of the larger scope of the work that you're doing. And getting a good understanding of their own relationship with mystical experiences or altered states of consciousness, non-ordinary states of consciousness, that kind of thing. It helps you kind of create a language for how you're going to talk about what it is that they experience in their sessions. Self-efficacy, so their own strength, their own resilience, acknowledging any systemic barriers or oppression that they're under, right? Their current emotional state, whether that's a new emotional experience, what is their norm as far as an emotional experience? Sometimes folks are just like high octane all the time, and that is normal for them. And wanting to know sort of what their baseline is so that you can assess, right, when they're having their psychedelic session and afterwards, like how that's changing over time. What coping skills they have or usually use when they're dealing with an emotional experience. If they're able to identify emotions at all as they're occurring. A lot of us are not. We're really closed off to emotions just because of the nature of our society, and needing to like work and like shut down so we can be more productive, right? So oftentimes just like identifying like, oh, this means sad can be really hard for people. So so even just like working to help them understand their emotions and how they might differ might be part of that preparation. Of course, their treatment history, you will always do a full sort of psychological intake, getting all of their background and history and things like that. Any prior experiences with other therapists or within the medical system, can be useful, if, especially when we're working with folks who are low income, who have had really poor interactions with doctors or the medical system in general, right? This could be one of those emotionally reparative experiences, maybe, if handled well, but knowing what their experiences have been in the past can be useful. Of course, there are diagnoses, if they have any. Sometimes they can be improperly diagnosed, right? Depending on the person, depending on the system that they're coming through. Lots of times, like the same diagnosis is just like handed out like business cards to people without really a full understanding of that person. So just because they come into you with a diagnosis doesn't mean you don't have to do a full overview of where they're at to really sort of narrow down if that's correct or not. And then any sort of collaboration with other providers that they work with, that they're comfortable with, weighing out the risks of having a diagnosis on their medical record specifically is another thing, because, right, if wanting to address, again, medical barriers, psychiatric barriers, barriers to their children, to their family, to, certain other resources that they may be receiving, having certain diagnoses might limit their ability to access those things. So being really careful about how you navigate those. And then the setting is basically everything outside of the person, the type of therapy space that you're in, if you're doing virtual versus in person, whether it's group versus individual, if it's unsupervised, which might be more financially accessible for folks because they can't pay for the therapist's time, or with a therapist, which is of course likely more expensive, but often more effective and efficient, like I mentioned before. Will they have time and space for integration outside of the sessions? Like, what is their work schedule like? What is their childcare like? Other life responsibilities? Do they live with people who might make it difficult for them to have time or space for their own work? Their finances, of course, which limits regarding accessing resources. Are there scholarships that you can help them find? Reduced fees, sliding scale, all that kind of stuff. General accessibility, so like mobility issues, like does your space allow for wheelchairs or people on crutches or other sorts of mobility adaptations in the space? Does the person have difficulty scheduling things? Maybe their executive functioning is limited and they may need some more support around that. Any sort of learning disabilities, maybe using art or creative approaches or tactile resources might be more useful for them than like journaling or something like this. Memory deficits, especially when using ketamine, thinking about that kind of thing. Language barriers, nonverbal communication, so alternatives for integration, if there's other ways that they can maybe do some, whether it's movement or dance or other things that, if they're limited in communication, might be a way for them to be more expressive. Of course, COVID risk is another thing to consider. Housing, how long have they been living in the space? Do they have secure housing? Do they have roommates? Is it a big building or is it a noisier spot? Is it a comfortable spot to be in? Do they have like a bed, a couch, or are they in a tent? Like, what is their living situation and how can we ensure that that's going to be a safe space, both for the session if they're using at home alone, or for, if they have a bed or a couch or whatever for integration, they have space to do that kind of thing. Of course, legal risks, if they're on probation or if they're in a mandated substance use treatment program, you might deal with some barriers there. Are there risks around, again, childcare, so DCFS or CPS related risks, if they're going to be doing this kind of work? Where would they go after the session if they're in a more vulnerable space? Is there a park or a community center they can go to if they just need to be around people? Maybe there's a friend or a family member they could go to. Are there other community organizations that can support, like a drop-in center type of space? You want to test that out. So having them actually go to those spaces, or feel what it's like to be in that space, to make sure that it's going to be a space where they can sort of regulate and that kind of thing before their medicine sessions, right? So they can test that out and know that that would be a good place for them to go. Social support, social history, what kind of support is available? Do they have a neighbor on site, case manager, community organization? Do they have an emergency contact? If there isn't one, what do you do? How easy is it for them to reach out for support? So do they have access to a telephone or text messaging or email, that kind of thing, to where they can reach someone? Or can they walk to a space where they can get support? Exploring current friendships and relationship dynamics, right, with them. So if there's things like drug use patterns with certain friends that maybe they want to avoid because that's part of their treatment goal, is working on their or moderating their use or something like this. Caretaking dynamics. So if they're dealing with childcare, caretaking for a family member, do they have someone else that can step in and support with that? Other sort of social skills and social capacity. Are they introverted, extroverted, that kind of stuff? Technology, of course. So if you're doing virtual sessions, do they have access to Wi-Fi, access to devices, or is their data or time limited? Can they get a Wi-Fi hotspot from the library? That's something that some local libraries will offer, that people can rent or take out a hotspot, that kind of thing. Phone accessibility, do they have a backup? And just kind of navigating any sort of technology support that might be needed. Do they have access to typical integration supplies? So writing supplies, space for stretching out, art supplies. Are there free events or art spaces they can tap into to be able to do some of that work if they want? Food access. Are there nearby food banks? Are they able to prepare food ahead of time and put it in a fridge for afterwards? That kind of stuff. Do they have access to fresh food? Are they living in a food desert? So all of that stuff is part of the setting, believe it or not, that we have to think about when working with clients. And of course, transportation. Can you get vouchers for Lyft to get them in and out of the office? Do they know someone with a car? How reliable is that person? What's the backup plan if that person falls through? All of that kind of stuff. And of course, hugely important is the relationship with the therapist. And that's kind of, encircles this, right? Of course, consent. So working through really helping them understand the entirety of this process of what they're sort of signing up for. That includes expectations, that includes things like talking about touch, and other sorts of boundaries and things like this, emotional support, plans for integration, all of the stuff we talked about around setting, helping them really understand like what it is that they're signing up for, what sorts of things are going to need to support them through the process. The therapist training, of course, is important to that. And then, with the populations that we work with, it's also important to consider any sort of identity differences and similarities and how that may support or limit the building of the therapeutic relationship. Just because, this is really deep work that we do. And this is where things can get kind of messy and complicated, right? It's really easy to over-identify with a client and fall into sort of guiding their experience because you think you know best because you're really sort of in touch or in tune with that person. Cultural appropriation is something we see a lot of in these spaces. There's definitely this sort of white psychedelic therapist saviorism that we see happening, and wanting to sort of temper that or manage that. Cultural differences around integration tools. So maybe you have a bias towards certain strategies being better than others, but maybe they have some cultural practices that might be really useful. for their own integration. There's no right or wrong way to do integration, really. It's all individual. So being able to, again, collaborate and utilize their own lived experience in that is good. And bringing the topic of identity into the therapy in a way that's client-centered, that's non-intrusive, prior to actually starting the psychedelic work. So in intake forms, validating their experiences regarding systemic oppression, and self-disclosure, from the therapist that sort of supports the client, things like that. There's a really beautiful resource through Black People Trip that I encourage y'all to check out and support her work. They have a guide for white practitioners. They have playlists. Robin has done a lot of work, a lot of free labor, and we should all very much support her in that work. And of course, your own judgments and assumptions are going to come into the space. So maybe your own past psychedelic experiences or your lack of them, adherence to specific models of psychedelic therapy, that kind of thing, and your own very own capacity and support system. So knowing when to refer out, when something is outside the scope of your own practice, supervision, getting clinical support and consultation, and setting and maintaining clear boundaries. So all of that falls in this. I'm guessing these others. Okay, so I will share the PDF that I mentioned. This is our contact info. So you can reach out to us, and specifically to support our work, because I mentioned we are both nonprofit organizations, very small nonprofit organizations, very much in need of funding. SAGE is currently seeking donations for their BIPOC Fellowship Fund. So being able to support their trainees. And then for us at SANA, we have our community care program, which provides low cost and sliding scale services to folks who can't otherwise afford it. So you can access those. I can put the donate links and stuff. I think it's pretty easy enough to type it into your own thing there, but that is all of that. I think that's the end. Oh, this is the end. This is Irina's dog Saychek. We made our own ad. So yeah.
Great.
Okay.
Thank you so much for sharing, Dr. Narloch.
Thank you.
I mean, it's really remarkable how many aspects of the individual, their lives, and their communities that you have to kind of think about as a therapist when promoting like the well-being of the whole person, right? So just all of the different facets. So we've been getting a lot of really great questions from our participants. So let's just dive in.
Okay.
So first, how would you recommend creating long-lasting life changes from psychedelic therapy? How can you take steps to prevent the lessons you learned from wearing off?
Yeah, that's a really good question. I think the first step to that is preparation. So oftentimes I think preparation doesn't get enough love. I think you're really in the process as you start your preparation. And that's what I mean by preparation is really anything that you could be doing to prepare yourself for a psychedelic experience, right? Whether that's going to therapy and sort of like decluttering some of the issues that maybe you've been working toward to really refine some legitimate, goals and things that you want to get out of a possible psychedelic experience. Preparation is key because in preparation, you're also thinking about integration. So what you're going to be doing after, during and after the psychedelic experience to help you carry that forward. So oftentimes the lessons learned, the insights, those sorts of things can be thought about in integration, whether that's journaling, whether that's getting connected to your body, whether that's talking to a therapist or a friend or going to an integration group or community group. And, you know, oftentimes if you're using music, listening to that music again afterwards in a sort of reflective way to kind of bring you back to that experience. So it's really about being intentional and I think really taking the time, not rushing through the experience, not rushing to get to the medicine, but really giving yourself and honoring yourself by giving yourself the time and space to really think through an intention, really think through what sorts of patterns and practices are beneficial to your healing and what sorts of patterns and practices sort of are a barrier to your healing.
Yeah, great. So in combating the hype, how can we best engage people in a more nuanced understanding of the risks and benefits of psychedelics?
Yeah, that's a good question. I think, again, I'm going to say it again, but preparation is key. I think there's a lot out there. I threw up, you know, we threw a bunch of just headlines on there, even things like How to Change Your Mind, the new Netflix documentary, right? That shows a very slim picture of what this work can be. And you know, that's always the concern, is that people will see that, and it's great. We want people to see that and know that this is a possibility, while also recognizing that like not everyone has that wonderful earth-shattering, like life-changed experience on psychedelics. Sometimes it's really challenging. And the psychedelic itself, that's not the thing that changes it, right? It's your work, it's your inner healing intelligence, it's the integration, it's really what comes after, how you hold on to that experience and weave it into your sort of daily life. That's where the real sort of healing takes place. So I think, you know, having those conversations with folks and recognizing like, yeah, this is so exciting. And like, let's remember that like everyone is different. We can't all expect to have earth-shattering, you know, mind-blowing experiences. It's great for that when that happens, but we want to make sure that those aren't the only ways to have meaningful, lasting change. Even an experience that's like meh, or like this didn't work, or I didn't feel anything, can actually tell you a lot about yourself if you like actually sort of get beyond the hype and dig deeper into what's actually coming up for you.
So there might be kind of a sort of element of interpretation of the experience,
Yeah,
and kind of what you take from it and the meaning that you take from it. Yeah, very interesting. So what are your thoughts about restricting practitioners to those with a degree or license? How might this impact access?
I think it's complicated because our medical system, our psychiatric system, is set up to, you know, in a very hierarchical manner, where licenses, degrees, certifications are sort of the markers of like who can do the work in this field. And I think a lot of folks understand that work with psychedelics is different than what we're used to, than how we do work in the quote unquote traditional, and I mean traditional in the sense of like Western medical tradition. It's just different. It just is. When I'm training people, one of the things that I say is there's just like a lot of unlearning that therapists have to go through to get through like the initial shock of like the kind of work that this is. And so to dismantle that, but like start a new way of you know, defining who is or is not a credible, legitimate person to do this work. And obviously one way will limit access, because the more degrees, the more certifications, the more, you know, tiers in the hierarchy there are, the more expensive that's going to be. and where there is other types of experience that relies on sort of an apprenticeship model or more of a mentoring model, more of a developmental sort of approach, whether that's in traditional sort of ayahuasca spaces or the underground, basically, that can be more accessible. And that's not always more accessible. A lot of underground guides or groups or whatever are ridiculously expensive. So just because it's underground doesn't mean it's cheaper necessarily. So I think the best thing that we can do is just open up the space to the new opportunities of new ways of doing this work and considering, other types of experience and other types of wisdom to be just as valuable as like all the textbooks that I read for many, many years of my education, right? So, because for some people, having a very like clean looking doctor with lots of degrees and lots of certifications that, is very on the up and up, like that is accessible to them because that makes them feel more safe. Whereas for other people, they want nothing to do with that. So, I think having all of that in the space will provide the best possibility for access, however someone might define it.
Great. So do you feel ketamine has become too expensive and therefore largely inaccessible to people? And if so, how do we make it more equitable and avoid this happening as other psychedelics become potentially legalized for therapeutic use?
So yeah, ketamine has actually become a little bit cheaper as it's kind of like ballooned, like ketamine services, ketamine infusion centers everywhere. That's actually helped drive the cost down a little bit. But ultimately, the thing that's going to help would be for insurance companies to cover the cost of racemic ketamine, which is our, old-fashioned, what's used in surgery ketamine, not this newfangled S-ketamine nasal spray stuff, which actually is pretty expensive, but insurance covers it. So it's just kind of one of those things. Yeah.
Great. In your presentation, you mentioned that a therapist's own psychedelic experiences or lack thereof can impact their practice and how they interact with clients. So in your view, is it essential for a therapist to have had a psychedelic experience before practicing therapy?
Yes, with a caveat. I think when we say psychedelic experience, I mean any sort of non-ordinary state, right? Which can be accessed through meditation, through dance, through breathing. While I do think there are definitely a lot of benefits to be had by having actual, medicine experiences, I think, and I do think everyone should do their own work as much as possible to really understand what it's like to have those experiences. I don't think it's 1000% necessary if someone has a lot of experience in non-ordinary states and is able to really talk openly about that. I definitely would say I would have a preference for someone to have experience with medicine. But, it's hard to access. So, when you get, talking about access and talking about training opportunities that include experiential opportunities that aren't ridiculously expensive, we get into that kind of thing too.
Yeah, makes sense, certainly. Concerning the risks of post-experience crashing when defense mechanisms are re-engaged, as you said, how can we build these risks into liability in terms of service policies? Is there a way to protect oneself from being sued for such risks so we can help clients genuinely?
Yeah, so that's, when I'm talking about informed consent, that's really part of having that conversation with the client ahead of time in preparation, helping them understand that is a possibility, that, that can happen. and what that looks like. So that when it does happen, they're like, oh yeah, Dr. Narloch talked to me about this. Like now I know that this is it, and then we can have that conversation. But it's always something that you want to have a conversation about before they've like decided to go through with the treatment process, and should be part of that informed consent.
So one question is if you could comment at all about kind of comparing the impact of psychedelic therapies like psilocybin, MDMA, LSD, compared to where ketamine treatment is right now. Any kind of comparisons between those?
I'm sorry, I didn't catch the first part.
Yeah, so psychedelic therapies like psilocybin, MDMA, LSD compared to ketamine treatment.
Mm-hmm. In what way? Like what do you want comparisons of?
Sure, maybe like effectiveness, or which which conditions it might be more helpful for. The question is more like impactful. Do you believe it can be as impactful? Yeah.
It depends, right? That's a very individual question. Certainly, there are things that MDMA-assisted therapy and psilocybin-assisted therapy are currently being researched on, right? So with PTSD, there's depression, and other things that the research is currently looking at. I would say I've been really surprised by ketamine as far as its impact to address all sorts of mental health issues. We've seen at Sana a slew of folks, from depression to substance use disorders to a lot of PTSD and trauma and anxiety. And because it's currently legal and accessible, like I think that has a huge impact. And I think people are sleeping on ketamine. I think there's a lot more possibilities there, we can access right now, whereas we're still kind of holding out hope, I feel like, with MDMA and psilocybin to come through. Those are also very powerful, and there's a lot of impact, but they'll be very, very expensive. I think MDMA-assisted therapy right now, as it's in expanded access, is about $50,000 for one treatment. The process of one treatment, so full 12 sessions. And that is just not accessible for a lot of folks. Whereas with ketamine-assisted therapy, following a very similar kind of protocol that at least that's how we do it at Sana. We follow a very similar protocol to that of MDMA-assisted therapy, because that's what we're trained in also. And it's like maybe $4,000. So still a lot of money. And we offset that with our community care fund for folks who need that. But like a little different than $50,000, right? So I think, when we're talking about accessibility, it's a huge impact that can have.
Yeah, this kind of leads into the next question. So are there any inclusion or increase of access efforts being made specifically for individuals living with disabilities and chronic illnesses, as most of these individuals have high costs of medical care, food, shelter, and are usually on fixed or low income?
So any inclusion, or I didn't catch the last part.
Yeah, so inclusion or just increased access efforts from Sana Healing or MAPS or anything.
Yeah,
that you're aware
I mean,
of.
again, that would depend on the individual. I mean, I kind of went through all sorts of things beyond what's usually considered. Often, a lot of the things that I mentioned as far as like the assessing in piece are things that would be automatically like ruling people out. And so that's, really what this whole entire session, this entire workshop is really considering, is the individual's boundaries, barriers, and working around them, creating opportunities for safety, and building up their resources so they may access this kind of work, whether that's financial, whether that's space, whether that's other disability considerations. All of that is kind of encompassed in this, and this is an evolution of a workshop too. So we're always looking and considering other things to include.
Great. Yeah. So a little bit more vague here. How do you see psychedelic therapy evolving in the future?
Yeah, it's hard to say. I mean, as far as evolving in the future, within the next few years, we'll have, MDMA assisted therapy will be FDA approved, and how that rolls out is still unclear, right? I think one of the things that will be different with that is it won't only be for PTSD, and there'll be a little bit more flexibility with the protocol and things like that, because once it's FDA approved, there's possibilities for like what's called off-label use, so some adjustments to the protocol. So someone might have more than the 3 sessions. Same with psilocybin. Once that's FDA approved, that one's just a little bit behind, I think, MDMA right now. The last I heard was late 2023, early 2024 for that, as far as approval. And there's also a lot of policy stuff happening, as folks were pointing out in the chat earlier. So it's possible that for psilocybin, we'll see medical use or clinical use or community use, depending on the different bills and legislation out there, that may come before psilocybin assisted therapy is approved by the FDA. That all just kind of depends on a whole different way of doing this kind of advocacy and work. So I guess in a lot of ways, it's up to us to determine what that's going to look like.
So maybe one more question that's kind of specifically about this workshop, and then we have some more general questions, but are there any differences in the efficacy of racemic ketamine versus the S-ketamine for depression treatment?
There has been some research. So even the initial research that got the FDA approval for S-ketamine, for Spravato, is not that strong. It's not as far as clinical research, clinical trial research is concerned. It's meh at best. So whereas there's like tons and tons and tons of research, much more than for racemic ketamine for depression and mental health, that it tends to show a lot more, at least slightly more beneficial than S-ketamine. And in fact, there's been some pushback and stuff like that, not necessarily in the US, but in other countries around S-ketamine and the approval. So there's some funny things happening there. But we have a lot of evidence for good old racemic ketamine and the benefits there, particularly when coupled with therapy as well. So there's infusion centers in every corner, it feels like, at least in Chicago. But when in the sort of scope of a full treatment protocol or treatment process, there's definitely a lot of potential benefit there.
Great. One more very good question just came in. So do you think that psychedelic therapy should be reserved as a last resort, as is the example of ketamine being offered for treatment-resistant depression? Or do you think it's acceptable for it to be a first step?
Yeah, that's a good question. I will say that for ketamine, it's no longer the treatment-resistant anymore. I think they are now looking at it for just regular old depression too. Yeah, I mean, I think, for the sake of efficiency and accessibility, right? I don't think people necessarily need to wait until they've exhausted every other mediocre approach to treatment, some of which are extremely invasive and, have a lot of, potential side effects that are at least uncomfortable. So yeah, I mean, I don't necessarily think it needs to be reserved as a last resort, when if we can provide somebody healing now instead of 10 years from now after they've exhausted 3 different types of treatments, I would rather do that.
Okay, great. So only a few more minutes left until our next speaker. So we just wanted to ask, do you have any advice that you'd like to share with trainees entering psychedelic therapy?
Yeah, gosh, a lot. But I would say really do the work to think through why you want to do this. There's a really useful sort of self-inquiry that we've included in an article that I wrote, and I can share it in the chat in a minute here. It's all about, the article itself is all about sort of psychedelic harm reduction treatment and sort of the ethical and legal considerations for a clinician. So like that alone is really useful, I think, for trainees to review. So I'll put that in the chat in a minute here. And at the end, there's an appendix that has some real good questions that I think anyone should be asking themselves in sort of getting into this work. I'd say as far as like finding training and experience, just being really thoughtful and intentional about, the kind of training that you get, thinking about costs versus like, comparing costs and the type of training and, what feels right to you ethically in this space, because there's a lot of different orgs and companies popping up doing training when there's still really no standard of training out there. So just being really, really careful about really looking through what the training entails, who's doing it, what their experience and expertise is, and making sure it aligns with your own values and ethics.
Great. Thank you so much. We really appreciate you having us here. Thank you for all the essential work that you do in the realms of both psychedelic therapy and then drug education. We really appreciate your time and your wisdom.
Thank you so much for having me. And yeah, I'll pop that link here in a minute.
Great. And then you can also find some of these resources in our link tree. So the Hasana Healing Collective, the Psychedelic Fundamentals course, we have a link tree that will take you to some of these places. So feel free to check that out. Now, I'm absolutely delighted to introduce Senator Scott Wiener. Senator Wiener represents San Francisco and northern San Mateo County in the California State Senate. He chairs the Senate Housing Committee, is vice chair of the California Legislative Jewish Caucus, and he's the immediate past chair of the California Legislative LGBTQ Caucus. Before taking public office, Senator Wiener practiced law for 15 years, including nearly a decade as a deputy city attorney in the San Francisco City Attorney's Office. He also served in a number of community leadership roles, including co-chair of the San Francisco LGBT Community Center and on the National Board of Directors of the Human Rights Campaign. He received degrees from Duke University and Harvard Law School and was a Fulbright Scholar in Santiago, Chile. Senator Wiener focuses extensively on housing, transportation, civil rights, criminal justice reform, clean energy, and alleviating poverty. We've invited Senator Wiener here today to discuss Senate Bill 519, a state bill aiming to decriminalize certain psychedelic substances in California. As the author of SB 519, Senator Wiener is striving to lead California away from the drug war. We are honored to have you with us here today. I'll hand it over to you now, Senator Scott Wiener.
Great. Well, thank you so much for having me, and thank you for the work that you do. Really, it's really the Lord's work to make clear that the war on drugs has been an abysmal failure, and that it's time to take a health-based approach to drug use instead of continuing this failed criminalization approach, which has just been so devastating to many communities, particularly communities of color, has really broken the bank for the taxpayer in terms of fueling mass incarceration, and has not in any way changed drug use. And so we need to take a new approach. And so I really appreciate your advocacy. And to me, when we decided to introduce Senate Bill 519 about a year and a half ago, it really was, this effort sits at the intersection of two real passions for me and for a lot of people. One is criminal justice reform and ending the war on drugs. But the other is to give people all the tools that they need to be healthy, particularly around mental health and addiction. I think what the bill does is it's very simple. It decriminalizes the possession and use of most psychedelic drugs, at least up to a certain quantity. It allows both individual possession and sharing. And it'll stand for the basic proposition that we shouldn't be arresting people and incarcerating them for possession and use of these drugs. I'd like to expand that to all drugs, but I don't think we're there yet politically. But of course, we know that psychedelic drugs have significant promise in terms of treating mental health and addiction challenges. We've known this for more than 50 years. There was so much promising work happening in the 1960s particularly around LSD. And then the war on drugs swept that away and everything got banned and it all got set back several decades. But we're now finally getting back on track with more and more research and peer-reviewed studies showing that various psychedelics can hugely benefit people who struggle with depression, anxiety, addiction, PTSD, etc. And yet we make it illegal for them to obtain or use these substances to get the help that they need. And in our coalition behind Senate Bill 519, we have amazing people with lived experience, particularly veterans, combat veterans, who served our country and were harmed and experienced significant mental health and addiction challenges. And they have had the opportunity to go to either Mexico or Peru for psychedelic therapy, and it's completely turned their lives around, allowed them to heal, allowed them to hit the reset button and to get on with their lives. We have parents, two parents who actually I know personally, and they're now involved, whose son, when he was a teenager, became addicted to heroin. They tried everything, every conceivable kind of rehab and intervention, and nothing was working. And their kid was spiraling towards homelessness and probably death. And then out of desperation, they sent him down to Mexico for an ibogaine therapy program. Went down for that for a few weeks, did the ibogaine therapy, came back and has never used heroin since. It completely ended his heroin addiction. And so the fact that we have these substances that can really help save people's lives, and yet it's completely illegal, is just horrifying to me. And so we need to move to a very, very different approach around psychedelics. There will be, I think, at some point, we hope, FDA approval of one or more psychedelic forms of therapy, particular medication, and that's great. But we can't wait for that, because some people say, why are you doing this bill? Just wait for the FDA to act. Well, the FDA, who knows when they're going to act? We're in 2022, and the federal government still has basically done nothing around cannabis as medical treatment. It's still completely illegal under federal law. All these decades after the medical cannabis movement started. So I don't have a lot of confidence that the FDA will, in the foreseeable future, move in this direction. But if it does, it could be another 5 to 10 years. In addition, it would probably be a very limited approval for a very specific type of substance formulated in a very specific way for very specific intervention, probably on a very temporary basis under the supervision of a physician. And that may work well for some people, but we know that psychedelic therapy is so much broader than that, and it should not be based on what a physician prescribes as a very specific medication in a very specific time period. And so that's why we're so committed to this bill. This is a bill that when I first introduced it, I thought it was likely to die an early death. This bill doesn't necessarily do that well in the California legislature, despite our progressive reputation, and we are progressive in a lot of ways around some areas like drug policy, we're not always the most progressive. That's why the voters have had to repeatedly step in on these issues. But our coalition was very convincing, and the science is convincing, and so we were able to pass it out of the Senate last year. It has passed both of its assembly policy committees. We hit the pause button and delayed it into this year because we weren't confident we had enough votes to pass it through the assembly last year. And so it will be up for consideration in its final committee in August. And then if that goes well, it will get a vote by the full assembly. It probably has a 50-50% chance of passing. We have no idea where the governor stands on the bill. So we're working very hard to just, make sure that members of the legislature have accurate information about psychedelics, that they're not misled by misinformation, because there's a lot of exaggerated and misinformation out there. There's been a lot of press in the last few years about the benefits of psychedelic therapy. So I think we have a chance. If it doesn't work out this year, we're not going anywhere. My hope is that at some point in the near future, we'll be able to get it done. So again, thank you so much for having me, and I'm happy to take any questions.
Great. Yeah, thank you for that great introduction to the bill. So first, what are the biggest hurdles to getting SB 519 passed at the moment?
I think there are a lot of legislators, even some fairly progressive Democrats, who really still have this notion that, that drugs are bad, that, which I think we can all agree, there's some drugs that are definitely bad. Fentanyl is bad, heroin is bad, but all drugs are bad. And that if we just tell people to not use drugs, they won't use drugs, and so it's sort of an old school approach, and we know it just simply doesn't work. And so when I say to people, hey, are you really suggesting that someone should be arrested and prosecuted for possessing LSD or mushrooms or whatever? They say, no, I don't think they should be arrested for that. I'm like, okay, that's what the bill does. But there's still, especially in suburban areas for Democrats, it's just a touchy issue. And people immediately go to, well, my kids are going to start using drugs. To which my response is, if your kids are going to use drugs, they're already doing it and they can already get it. Let's make it a little safer for them. And if your kid does use drugs, do you want your kid to be arrested? Do you want your kid to have a record? And they don't have a good answer to that, but it's so that's the toughest part of the politics.
Yeah. So this is related to this. So misinformation and fear mongering are pervasive tools used to justify unscientific drug policies and obstruct decriminalization. What do you think are effective strategies to combat misinformation and win public support?
I think always coming back with the facts, because especially around psychedelics, the facts are so clear and so one-sided. So just coming back over and over again, and like people should be sharing these articles that come out in national publications about the benefits of psychedelics, just having an army of people online willing to share and then respond to misinformation. It's tough. I mean, the good part is the anti-psychedelics people are not like this avalanche tidal wave of online misinformation like we see with some other issues. So I think it is something that we can win in the court of public.
So in recent years, citizens' initiatives have led to decriminalization of drugs in Oregon. In California, we've seen citizens' initiatives like Decriminalize California aim to do the same, starting with psilocybin. What role do you think citizens' initiatives could play to help end the war on drugs? Are there certain policy changes that these initiatives could push for that potentially politicians can't or shouldn't?
Well, I mean, we've seen repeatedly in California that the voters have really got, and I want to be really clear, California legislature has passed enormous numbers of criminal justice reform bills, some very, very, very significant decarceration laws. So I don't want to suggest that the legislature is not doing what it needs to do. The legislature's done a lot. And actually, the legislature has tragically at times gotten shot down by the voters, we ended cash bail legislatively, and the voters overturned that decision. But there are some subjects that the legislature just wasn't going to be in a position politically to act, like reforming the three strikes law, reducing penalties for drug possession, which the voters did, to prioritize treatment over incarceration, legalizing medical cannabis and then legalizing adult use, reducing penalties for some nonviolent felonies. So the voters, stepped in when needed. And I'm hoping the voters don't have to do so again. I'm hoping we just get this passed and it doesn't have to go to the voters, but it is possible that that would be needed. Although if we're going to go to the voters, I would hope we would go with something fairly broad.
Yeah, thank you. How can individuals not already in government get involved to help SB 519 pass this year?
Sure. Well, there are two sponsoring organizations, or two amazing groups that work with combat veterans. One is called Heroic Hearts. One is called Vets. There are also other groups involved. Anyone can contact my office. We can give you the list of supporters and let you know, how to engage.
Great. Could you comment on the decision to exclude peyote from the bill, and how was that decision how did you come to that decision?
Yeah, well, we came to that decision in consultation with some Native American stakeholders. The issue of peyote is a very, very controversial one. On the one hand, we don't want people being arrested for using peyote, and Native American practitioners already have protection under federal law to use peyote ritually. There was concern that if we were to include peyote in the bill, that it could facilitate peyote tourism. And peyote is endangered, and we want to make sure we're really prioritizing Native American communities in terms of having access to it. So that's why we excluded it from the bill. There are some people who disagree with that, who wanted it to be included. There are some people who thought we didn't go far enough, because the bill does decriminalize mescaline, which is in peyote, but found in other plants as well. So we do decriminalize other forms of mescaline. Some people thought we shouldn't do that. So we weren't going to make everyone happy, but we ultimately worked with the Native American church and took a middle path of simply excluding peyote.
Is the traditional FDA medication development pipeline appropriate for potentially widely therapeutic, broad-acting compounds like psychedelics?
Maybe not. I think that, as I mentioned at the beginning, my concern, anything that the FDA does on this in improving treatments is almost certainly going to be good, but it's going to be very focused and narrow. We have specific kind of medication, specific dosage for a specific period of time for very specific indications under the temporary supervision of a physician, most likely. And again, for some people that might be great. There are people who can do a few doses of psychedelics, and may not need any more. I think it's great for that to happen through the FDA, but it's not enough. And I think we need a broader approach with psychedelics. And step one is saying we're not going to arrest people anymore for it. And then we have to consider whether to legalize it more broadly like we do with cannabis.
And this is, related. What role do you see policy playing in discerning responsible drug use from irresponsible drug use? Because if we have these applications outside of, the FDA approved uses, how do we handle that?
Yeah, I mean, again, if we ultimately legalize it, there are ways of doing that, like we do with cannabis, and make sure people have good information about how to use safely. I think allowing sharing is important so that people aren't forced to use alone. I think we should create a certification for therapists who engage in psychedelic therapy. That is also a way for people to be able to use more safely. It's always going to be, just like there is with alcohol, people can abuse or overuse or irresponsibly use any substance. But we want to just make sure we're giving people at least as many options as possible to use safely.
How do we create new drug policies without mimicking the racial and class biases that are inherent to the drug war?
I'm sorry, can you repeat that?
Yeah, how do we create new drug policies without mimicking the racial and class biases that are inherent to the drug war?
Well, I mean, I think shifting from a criminalization approach to a health approach will help do that. And so I think that is a significant step. We have to make sure we're avoiding some of the pitfalls that we've experienced with cannabis, where some of the communities that were most harmed by the war on drugs with respect to cannabis are then effectively cut out of the legal cannabis market. We have to make sure that does not happen.
What, if any, pushback are you observing from Big Pharma in your support of SB 519?
I'm not seeing any pushback from pharma. There are people, I don't think they're like pharma, but there are people and some sort of entrepreneurial kind of people who have wanted a different approach. There are people with a lot of opinions, but it's not the pharma industry as far as I can tell.
Right, someone's asked, how closely are you watching the policy changes in Canada, and how are these changes informing your point of view?
I haven't, maybe I should be following Canada more closely, so I haven't seen there are any recent changes. I haven't seen those, but I will take a look.
Just a few more. So how can we center health and drug policy reform without pathologizing drug use?
Yeah, I mean, and psychedelics is a good example of that. That when we talk about, like, for the most extreme cases like the synthetic opioids, fentanyl, carfentanil, which are so dangerous for people, and we don't want to criminalize them or stigmatize them. We want to, help people be safe and be healthy. But regardless of how we interact with that, fentanyl is really problematic and is killing a lot of people. Psychedelics are not. It's psychedelics are by more akin, it's not the same as cannabis, of course, but more like cannabis, where it's a substance that, like any substance, can be abused and can be used in a harmful way, but there are many, many ways to use it in a way that's the opposite of harmful. It's beneficial. And so I think that there's some differences there. But in the end, we want to make sure that as we transition away from the war on drugs, that we're not shaming people, that we're simply making sure that people have access to treatment and recovery if that's what they're ready for, but also safer ways to use whatever drugs that they are using.
Great. How do you address those that are concerned that SB 519 would open an avenue for Big Pharma to monetize upon decriminalization without thinking of things like equity and inclusion?
SB 519 won't do that because it's simply a decriminalization bill. It's simply saying we're not going to arrest people anymore. If we were to move forward, and one of the things that SB 519 does, it also sets up a task force to make recommendations for the future. Do we want to create a certification for psychedelic therapists? Do we want to move towards full legalization? Do we want to create a regulated market? Those are future discussions. If we do decide we want to move towards legalization and regulation, that's when we would need to make sure that we are not allowing big corporations to take it over.
Great. Well, I know you have a busy day, and so I don't want to keep you too long. If anyone has any final questions, let me know now. But well, the final thing is, what are you kind of most excited about in a world in which, psychedelics are decriminalized in California?
I'm just excited that people will have access to substances that can improve their lives, whether it's treating a specific mental health or addiction diagnosis, or whether it's just improving the quality of their life and making them happier, more productive person, and allowing them to get to know themselves better and the world around them. I think there are a lot of really great possibilities, and if we can just move away from people having fear that they're doing something illegal and bad and they're going to get in trouble, I just think it creates a lot of possibilities.
Great. Yeah, thank you so much. We really appreciate your time here and for fighting against the drug war, all of us here. This is, we're really inspired by you and we've enjoyed learning from you. And we hope your efforts are successful. So
me too. But
yes.
Thank you for having me, and thank you again for your advocacy.
Of course.
And we would welcome your participation in this legislation.
Great. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you.
So it is my pleasure to introduce our keynote speaker, Dr. Rick Strassman. Dr. Strassman is a clinical associate professor of psychiatry at the University of New Mexico School of Medicine, an author of DMT, The Spirit Molecule, a modern psychedelic classic, which details Rick's experiences conducting human research trials with dimethyltryptamine, or DMT. Led to this powerful substance through his earlier study of the pineal gland as a potential biological locus for spiritual experiences. He administered several hundred doses of DMT to approximately 60 volunteers between 1990 and 1995. In fact, Dr. Strassman was the first person in the United States, after 20 years of prohibition, to embark on human research with psychedelic substances, and his work is considered by many to mark the beginning of the psychedelic renaissance in the US. He has published over 40 peer-reviewed scientific papers and has served as a reviewer for 20 psychiatric research journals. He's been a consultant to the U.S. Food and Drug Administration, National Institute on Drug Abuse, Veterans Administration hospitals, and Social Security Administration. He has provided consultation to many of the psychedelic startups that began appearing in 2020, including Atai, MindMed, and the Noetic Fund. He is on the scientific advisory boards for Alexander Shulgin Research Institute and Ninian Therapeutics. In addition to DMT, the Spirit Molecule, Dr. Strassman is the author of DMT and the Soul of Prophecy, Joseph Levy Escapes Death, and a co-author of Inner Paths to Outer Space. He also has a new book coming out, The Psychedelic Handbook, a practical guide to psilocybin, LSD, ketamine, MDMA, DMT, and ayahuasca. So here to present Mushroom Messianism, the psychedelic religion of mystical consciousness, we're honored to welcome Dr. Rick Strassman.
Well, thank you very much, Anousheh. It's a nice introduction. I figured I would, tackle some controversial ideas. And after all, whenever you're talking about drug policy, there's bound to be some controversy. So before we get much further, let me, it's a pitch for my new book. It's called The Psychedelic Handbook, and it's available on Amazon for pre-order, and you can order it through my website, in which case I will inscribe and sign it. Okay, so psychedelics are everywhere these days. There's publications every few days about the things that they're good for. Most of us have read about the benefits for depression, anxiety, substance use disorders. So the list goes on. I mean, it's an ever-increasing number of conditions that seem to be responsive to psychedelic-assisted psychotherapy. And just this afternoon, I found 2 more articles that that appeared. One is about I'm a teenager who treated his cannabis-induced psychosis with LSD and with DMT. And there's another paper just came out today on microdosing ibogaine for bipolar disorder. There's also a booming interest in using psychedelics to increase wellness. And that extends from improving your meditation to resolving the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. And some of these are kind of out there. For example, the attribution of consciousness to non-human things. So it's the Wild West at this point. And in a lot of ways, it's similar to the enthusiasm which broke out with the first wave of interest in psychedelics. Well, so how do psychedelics work? We're understanding their biology fairly well as time goes on. I'll be speaking mostly about the classic compounds like LSD, psilocybin, and DMT, but other compounds like MDMA and ketamine, even though their pharmacology differs from the classical compounds, they still have got comparable effects on functional connectivity, and there's a lot more similarity in the subjective effects than there are differences. So they also stimulate neurogenesis, which is the conversion of stem cells into neurons, and increase neuroplasticity, which is the number of functional synaptic connections. And there's also neuroendocrine effects. For example, oxytocin is stimulated by the classic compounds and by MDMA. And oxytocin is the the pro-social hormone. Psychologically, they enhance, or they may enhance, the traditional mechanisms of effective psychotherapy. For example, the transference between the therapist and the patient, recalling forgotten memories, emotional catharsis, those kinds of things. And most discussions of Buddhism are more psychological than religious. And if you're looking at Buddhist psychological principles, that's viewed through the through the deconstruction of one's ongoing sense of experience, and demolishes the illusion of a personal self and any abiding reality to ongoing experience. And as a result thereof, one is liberated from suffering. So further on in the talk, I will discuss how psychedelics may be super placebos, and that can synthesize a number of the perspectives I just discussed. So spiritually, even though there's a strong desire to reconcile spirituality and science, I think we need to be careful in defining what is spirituality and what is science. And in the case of the mystical, or the psychedelic religion of mystical consciousness, it is based on the belief that there is no revelation without salvation. In other words, it's miraculous. And it's a proposal which uses scientific methodology to support faith-based beliefs. Well, so what's the role of acute subjective effects? Well, there are strong correlations between scores on questionnaires and the desired outcome. But it's very important to keep in mind that correlation doesn't mean causation. So the questionnaires which are used are developed by groups which have got a pre-existing belief about how psychedelics work. So for example, the mystical experience questionnaire is predicated on the belief that there's no revelation without salvation. If you have a mystical experience, you'll be healed. There are other questionnaires which are basically built upon the same kinds of premises, either insight, flexibility, emotional breakthrough. Back in the day, there were other models about how the psychedelics worked. For example, the group up in Saskatoon, Saskatchewan, believed that you could induce a time-limited case of the DTs or delirium tremens, which occurs when you really bottom out from drinking, and a lot of people would stop drinking after the DTs, and they believe that there was enough similarity between the LSD state and the DTs, that could work, and it did work using that kind of model. And if you look at psychosis as a spiritual emergency, which ultimately heals, you could give psychosis rating scales, and I wouldn't be surprised if those didn't strongly correlate with a beneficial outcome if you believe that temporary psychosis was curative. And Evgeny Krupitsky is a colleague in St. Petersburg, Russia, and he has an interesting model of ketamine psychotherapy. For example, if you want to stop smoking, when you're tripping on ketamine, he'll bring you an ashtray with these stale cigarette butts and some stale coffee in the ashtray, and he sticks it under your nose and he says, "Is this what you want to continue?" And a lot of people stop smoking cigarettes. So it isn't specifically the flavor of the experience. I think the more important element is the overall intensity of the effect, so depending on the model that you are educated about and that the treatment team is applying, then the intensity, I think, will end up correlating with the desired outcome as much as the specific kind of effect. So there's a lot of talk about spiritual experiences, and I think you could divide them into two different types. All spiritual experiences are not mystical unitive. So the interactional or the interactive relational kind of spiritual experience is also valid, and I'll be comparing them. So the phenomenology of each of those types of experiences is identical, whether it occurs within the context of a traditional religion or outside of it. If it occurs within a religious holder, as it were, it's called a religious experience. And if it's independent of traditional religion, it's called a spiritual experience. So the mystical unitive state, the hallmark is a sense of losing your sense of self and of merging and of unity. It's empty of images and of content. There's transcendence of time and space, which is difficult to pin down. What exactly does transcendence of anything really mean? It's portentous. It's certain. It feels more real than real. It's nonverbal, and the term which applies to it being nonverbal is ineffable. But if you read the literature, the spiritual literature, there's a lot of ink spilt over nonverbal experiences. So you can approach nonverbal experiences verbally. So I think oftentimes the description of the state as ineffable is either out of laziness. You just say, "Oh wow, that was so strong or so meaningful that I can't describe it," or it's a lack of vocabulary. It's often blissful, and the paradigm is Kensho Amor Satori in Zen Buddhism. So the interactive relational state is full of content. There's recognizable objects and beings. The sense of an individual self is maintained or even strengthened. There's interaction and relationship with the contents of the state. Time and space continue. They're warped or stretched or made unusual, but still there's a beginning and a middle and an end. The mood effects are more variable. It's full of information, often verbal, which could be transmitted telepathically even. It also feels more real than real. So the paradigm of the interactive relational state is in the Hebrew Bible, the Hebrew biblical prophetic tradition. And if you read the text carefully, the Hebrew Bible, there's not one instance of a unitive mystical state in the entire text, all 22 books. So the DMT state, according to my volunteers and according to my own experience, is that it's interactive relational. We didn't really coach our volunteers. Well, and keep in mind also that all of our volunteers were normal volunteers. They weren't coming in for treatment. But still, we just told people to have their own experience. And keep your eyes open, keep your wits about you. It's short, it's over quickly. You may think that you've died because you've left your body, but don't worry, you are holding down the fort. But just keep your wits about you, and come back and describe what the experience was like. And in all of our volunteers, only one of those people had a mystical unitive state, and it was a fellow that was a religious studies major in college, was always interested in a mystical unitive state, belonged to a religious organization that emphasized his attainment. So the experience was a psychedelic experience. It was mind manifesting. One of our volunteers was a nurse with a long-standing interest in the near-death state, and she had a near-death experience. A couple of people underwent some healing of some traumatic memories and experiences. So it was interesting, because most of the volunteers, as well as I, expected a unitive mystical experience. because, most of them, were also practitioners of Eastern meditation, but it was anything but. So that led me to studying the Hebrew Bible. Prophetic experience is an altered state, any altered state in the text. It isn't only Jeremiah or Ezekiel, let's say, but it could be, it's anybody speaking with either God or God's angels, out of body experiences, inspiration, courage, those kinds of things. So in my book that I published in 2014, DMT and the Soul of Prophecy, I suggest a role for naturally occurring DMT, mediating the phenomenology of the prophetic experience, the visions and the voices. And it's DMT, which is made in the brain. It isn't exogenously administered or consumed. So there is a need to the mystical unitive model. Most psychedelic experiences are interactive and relational. We live in an, we live in an interactive relational world. The non-verbal nature of the mystical unitive state lends itself, to abuse. You can just make it up as you go along. Saying, "Oh, the white light means X, Y, and Z," and I'm convinced. So I think also if you place a goal to have the mystical unitive state, and if you don't have it, it can be catastrophic. There's a there's a case that's buried at the very end of the online only supplemental material from the Hopkins terminally ill study of a suicide in one of the patients that got a super small dose of psilocybin as an active placebo, and with all of the hype and the expectation that, okay, I've got cancer and I'm dying, and this mystical experience will heal me of my distress. And he had no response at all. So 11 days later, he killed himself. So that case is described very briefly in that supplemental material. And I think that case ought to be discussed in public, and the things that went wrong or could have been different. I think it's the case of the model, having an adverse effect. So what is the so-called psychedelic religion of mystical consciousness? Well, let me get to my notes here. So it is it's what first developed at Spring Grove, which was the state mental hospital that was affiliated with the University of Maryland back in the 60s and the 70s. And I started, I began to think about the religious aspect of the research after a conversation with Dr. Uhlenhuth, who was one of my mentors at UNM. We were talking one day about the Spring Grove work. This was 1985, like 3 years before I even started my application process. And so Dr. Uhlenhuth was at Hopkins for quite a long time. In the 60s, he was the acting chairman of the Department of Psychiatry at the University of Chicago. Was the president of the American College of Neuropsychopharmacology, the world's premier organization, for clinical psychopharmacology research. So he was a site visitor, to the Spring Grove group in the early 1970s when they were applying for a renewal of their psychedelic grant, and they did not get the renewal. And I asked him why, and he said they got religion. And he explained, that they were convinced as a result of their work, that all you needed was a mystical experience, and they stopped looking, for mechanisms of action.
they figured they had made the discovery, and it was only a matter of applying this panacea to any condition. And they kind of gave up science and became zealous, and their funding was not renewed. So this mystical religion has been resurrected with the Hopkins group, and it's spreading outward. So the fundamental, or the foundational text is Bill Richards' book. It's called Sacred Knowledge. So he was at Hopkins. So he was at Spring Grove, and the title indicates its approach. Sacred isn't a term you usually think about in scientific discourse, and knowledge is a bit lofty. I mean, generally when you're talking about science is information. So it's premised on the belief that there's a hardwired universal spiritual experience which underlies all of the religions out there. It heals and it saves. And the epigraph, or the epigraph of Bill's book is a quote from Paul Tillich. There's no there's no revelation without salvation. And Bill gives talks like Revelation, like Revelation Now, which isn't really what you would expect from a hard-boiled scientific psychotherapy researcher. So he is able to make these claims because of being convinced that the correlation between attainment of a mystical experience, which strictly speaking is high scores on the mystical experience questionnaire, is causative as opposed to only an association. So as a result of his conviction that mystical experience heals, he then is able to make such statements like there is a God, consciousness survives after death, death is like a psychedelic experience, and all of those are unverifiable. They're faith-based. So what is that universal religion? Well, it's a melange of Advaita, Vedanta, mystical Christianity, New Age beliefs. But what happens if you don't agree with the universal religion? That's kind of tricky, because I mean, has there ever been a universal religion, and what's new about this one? So it leads to some hostility, antagonism toward the interactive relational state, and it puts Judaism and its biblical tradition into the crosshairs of the universal tradition, because Judaism is it's verbal, it isn't universal at this point. I mean, in the future perhaps, but it's not now. I mean, that's quite clear. It's particularistic. So because of the incompatibility between Jewish belief and this New Age kind of religion, Bill is not friendly towards Judaism. He speaks of it as foothills as compared to the mountain peaks, which in a way is a simple repetition of the Christian trope that Judaism is of the flesh, bound to earth, whereas Christianity is the New Testament, it's of the spirit, transcends the flesh. So in his book, he denigrates the prophets and prophetic experience. He points to my work, the DMT prophetic states work, and refers to the possibility of endogenous DMT playing a role. That all the existence of endogenous DMT means is all of us are carrying. I mean, that's as far as he takes it. He denigrates scripture and offers his own 13 insights on outdoing Moses by 3. He glorifies Jesus, Paul, and Christianity. He hints that the archetype of Jesus appearing in trips is an intimation of the second coming. His two most problematic patients, he makes the point of stating, are Jewish. And I think it is worth mentioning that his first experiences on psilocybin were supervised by by Hans Karl Leuner, who was a psychiatrist in Hitler's armed services. So with any religion, you've got your new vocabulary, and I think one of the most popular or the most pervasive of these new terms is entheogen, and it makes a lot of assertions which are all theological, which is that there is a God, and God exists within us, and you could take a drug and it will generate God within you, or a religious experience. Those are all non-scientific assertions. They're theological, based on faith. One of the other terms coming out of the Hopkins work is drugs occasioning mystical or mystical type experiences. And I've got in my database of references, I've got over 6,500 papers, and only the ones from Hopkins use the term occasion. There's no reason not to use the word produce or cause. So that's another bit of jargon. Challenging experiences came out of Hopkins. They've got a challenging experience questionnaire, but why not use adverse effects? That's the standard biomedical psychotherapy model. So adverse effects are mild, moderate, or severe. They're acute, short-term, long-term. So challenging experiences. I mean, you can have a few minutes of anxiety as you're coming on, or you could have intractable psychosis, and which is a challenging experience. So I think it really muddies the waters unnecessarily. There's another new term which is called reactivations, which occurs to flashbacks, and why not flashbacks? It harkens back to PTSD, and I think that flashbacks may be understood through looking at the mechanisms and interventions for PTSD. So I think flashbacks is a good term. It's been around since the 60s. And instead of long-term effects, you've got this expression of enduring effects, which is a bit more inspiring, more noble, but it steps outside of the regular vocabulary that most of us are used to dealing with. So it's an attempt to place psychedelic research and practice into some kind of precious, sacred, unique category, and it's a repudiation of the mainstream, which isn't necessary, because if there's one thing we need to keep in mind with introducing psychedelics back into the larger culture, and specifically the medical and psychotherapeutic, is to stay within the mainstream. We don't need preciousness. I've been I've been critiquing I've been critiquing the Hopkins model for quite a few years now, and their response has not been what you would call measured, or let's see, or systematic. It's basically things like your comments or your critique is incomprehensible, it's offensive, it's slanderous, it's salacious, and I've got all of these responses in writing. So next up, I figured after slanderous and salacious would be heretical. And, I have to admit, sometimes it feels like I'm Don Quixote. I'm attacking the windmills. But still, I think it's important to, keep our focus. Okay, so everybody must get stoned, Bob Dylan. So, this is an article that is in press or just came out from the Hopkins group, talking about ethical issues regarding, non-subjective psychedelics as the standard of care. You know, it's kind of hard to know where to start. When this first came out, I thought it may have been a joke because the distortion of what's really going on is so striking. You know, first of all, the new compounds are not called, you know, non-subjective psychedelics. They're called, you know, non-psychedelic psychedelics. We don't know what the subjective experience is like. And with respect to standard of care, I mean, what's standard of care at this point in the field? And ethical issues, well, we can discuss those. Well, you know, so what's all the hoopla about? Yeah, there's a couple of groups, you know, one at UC Davis and one at the University of North Carolina that, you know, that are developing compounds that stimulate the same receptors that classic psychedelics do without behavioral effects in lower animals, but still produce the same kinds of biological effects with respect to plasticity and neurogenesis. And those compounds, which are, you know, not psychoactive in lower animals, you know, seem to reduce depression, anxiety, administration of drugs in the same manner as do the compounds with behavioral effects. We have no human data yet. This is all in the animal. So I think we need to not get ahead of ourselves. The two most focused upon compounds are one called TBG, which is an ibogaine derivative, and another, you know, which is an isomer of DMT. But the main compound is the ibogaine compound right now. You know, so the thrust of the Hopkins paper is an objection to, you know, Dave Olson's, you know, belief, you know, that these compounds offer advantages, you know, relative to their psychedelic, you know, cousins. And, you know, one of their arguments is that, you know, because these compounds in humans can cause meaningfulness or a profound experience, then everybody ought to be able, you know, to have that experience. But, you know, who says meaningful is good? You know, Charles Manson gave LSD to his, you know, followers, and, you know, they had meaningful experiences. You know, so it's the steering of the effect, you know, rather than just, you know, simply that they're meaningful. And if there's uncontrolled use, that, you know, meaningfulness may just go off the rails. You know, they also, you know, bring up the, the canard that, you know, there's, you know, that because of the correlation between subjective effects and outcome, you know, that even though it's not stated in, you know, black and white, you know, they allude to the fact, you know, that these, you know, subjective effects, you know, lead to the outcome. But, you know, psilocybin, if you look at the Imperial College study comparing, you know, psilocybin, you know, with an SSRI, it was no more effective than depression, than the than the SSRI for depression. And there are certainly a lot more acute side effects, and there could be flashbacks as well, which, you know, don't occur with SSRIs. You know, so they do point out that there's a very small number of people that are bad candidates, you know, for psychedelics, so like, for example, schizophrenia. And otherwise, everybody who is eligible for, you know, psychedelic, you know, treatment ought to get it. But, you know, what if, you know, somebody just, you know, wants their depression, anxiety, or, you know, drug abuse problems to improve, and they don't want to trip? I mean, you know, tripping is demanding. And so they, you know, closed, you know, by saying it's, you know, the ethical, you know, moral, you know, duty of healthcare practitioners to, you know, provide such experiences. But, that is that isn't a mainstream view of healthcare. I mean, you know, the code of Hippocrates is, you know, do no harm. And I'm not sure if it's our responsibility to give people meaningful experiences. That's, you know, more the, you know, purview of religion. So hopefully I've got you guys worked up. We're almost there. Yeah, so in a way, it's a tempest in a teapot. Oh, okay. Well, yeah, in a way, it's a tempest in a teapot. You know, the antidepressants promote neuroplasticity, and you know, that isn't, you know, really discussed all that much. And antidepressants and, you know, psychedelics are, you know, more effective when they're combined with psychotherapy. So you need to direct, how those new connections are made under the influence of enhanced, neuroplasticity. Are you in psychotherapy? Are you meditating in the forest with a bunch of monks? Are you watching, violent pornography? What is the what is the setting, which is, directing these new, nerve cell connections? They're not going to be just random. They're going to respond to what's going on around you and in your mind. And I think, I think the choice of calling these compounds psychedelics is unwise. We can call them something else. They're neuroplastogenic serotonin agonists, 2-ANPs, which isn't much more than than the SSRIs. And I think kind of the scolding messianic fervor of the Hopkins approach is revealing. And I think it points to the messianism. What is the Messiah? Well, it's related to the Hebrew word for anointing with sacred oil, and the Greek translation ultimately ended up in the word Christ. The popular understanding is like the leader of a cause, the liberator of a people, and messianism is the belief in the advent of a Messiah, which could be a drug or a class of drugs that act as the savior of a group of people. In other words, all of mankind, or anybody that is suffering. So this article just crossed my desk today to give you an example of what's going on out there. Psychedelics, mystical experience, and pro-environmental behaviors. So if you trip, you have a mystical experience, you will save the environment. Well, so what are we dealing with? Well, I hate to be boring, but it's set and setting. Who are you when you trip? What is your intention? What are your hopes? What are your expectations? How suggestible are you, to the beliefs and the suggestions of those around you? Do you believe that psychedelics are helpful? In which case you will volunteer for either a study or a treatment. And I would imagine the brains and the minds of those who volunteer are different than the brains and the minds of those who don't. So it isn't that just everybody ought to get stoned. The setting is dependent also, besides the the indoors, outdoors, what is the specific environment, but it also includes the beliefs of the people around you, what they're telling you is going to happen, and what it means. So in my new book, I've got a kind of a obtuse, dense chapter combining the the concepts of psychedelics and panaceas and placebos. But I think it's important, and I think both it's important from the point of view of policy and also from the point of view of scientific experimentation. Psychedelics appear to do whatever those who take them and give them want them to do. So you can have a mystical experience which will cure your depression, or it'll strengthen your neo-Nazi beliefs. It just depends on who you are and the environment. And in that first slide, where I just gave you that huge list of things that psychedelics help, well, that's the panacea, which means heal, to heal, to heal everything, to heal all. And I think it's a function of the enhancement of the placebo response, which occurs through the biology of psychedelics. And placebo response isn't only in your head. There's endocrine effects of placebo. There's immune effects. There's inflammatory responses. All kinds of things. It's a biological response. But it occurs completely out of consciousness, behind the scenes. It's an activation of one's innate healing mechanisms, which are contained in the mind-brain complex. So I think that the neuroplasticity, neurogenesis occurs when the experience is intense enough, and the intensity is a reflection of the activation of the placebo response. So there are a couple of interesting ideas. Anousheh, told me the other day that you can induce placebo analgesia in rodents, and if that's the case, maybe giving a small dose of psilocybin could enhance placebo analgesia in lower animals. And it also suggests that placebo responsive conditions in humans would respond better to psychedelic assisted treatment compared to non-placebo ones. So for example, autoimmune diseases or inflammatory diseases, asthmatic conditions, allergic conditions would respond better than cancer, for example. So as a historical footnote, I met with Bob Jesse from the Council of Spiritual Practices. So he initiated and supported the original Hopkins mysticism study. Well, so we met after I completed my study of psilocybin and DMT in 1995, and he was interested in a mysticism study and asked me if I'd be interested in doing one. And I was not, because as I mentioned earlier, I discovered that Dr. Uhlenhuth was right, that psychedelics are mind manifesting. They're not religiously intrinsically religious or spiritual. So in a way, Bob was asking me to contributing to the rebirth of the evangelical movement. Which I didn't want to do. Still, though, I figured if you know something, you should share it. Otherwise, what's the point of knowing it? So I shared with the Hopkins group a few years later after they took on Bob's project. My paperwork from my NIH funded grant for DMT and psilocybin, the FDA paperwork, the DEA paperwork, and all that. So in a way, well. It isn't that I have only myself to blame, but I contributed, to the work at Hopkins getting off the ground as early as it did, which, by the way, was only 10, 12 years later after I stopped. So, where to now? Well, I think we need to stay within the biomedical and psychological disciplines. Sensible drug policy, needs to rely on common sense, not religion. Even though it might be cloaked in a garb of scientific respectability. I think what we're seeing is science being used to promote a theological movement. And if we are interested in spirituality, we should leave it to the theologians and the clerics. I mean, psychiatrists and psychologists really have no business sticking their nose into it. I think there ought to be a greater emphasis on interactive psychedelic experiences and questionnaires developed and correlations made with outcome. And I think instead of mystical experience, we would be that much further ahead if we just called them unitive and kept the religious stuff out of there. So we need to prepare for backlash. Don't glorify the benefits because people are going to be disappointed. Don't dismiss the risk. The media and the politicians are going to start asking us once the emergency room visits increase with legalization, decriminalization, psychiatric admissions, suicides, homicides, which are real phenomena. Long-term psychosis. That all occurred in the 60s and the 70s. If you speak with any of the integration therapists out there, and I speak with them, here and there, it's a bloodbath. I mean, people, trip with all kinds of ideas, like they'll have a mystical experience. And if they have, got any problems, they're challenging and they're embarrassed, because it is only, is, being, manic or is being psychotic, challenging, so they're in terrible shape and they expect these integration therapists to put the pieces back together. And also, psychedelics are, going to be associated with, controversial, social causes, messianism, and, malignant uses by terrorists. Another Charles, Manson, I'm sure is, working on his next project.
Great. Thank you for that, Dr. Strassman.
Sure.
So definitely a lot to unpack, quite a few issues to discuss for sure. So starting with one, so you mentioned that, psychedelics could be argued to have panacea-like effects, demonstrating therapeutic potential for numerous neuropsychiatric conditions. But could this instead suggest that we should shift our current understanding and classification of these conditions? Could things like depression, anxiety, addiction, etc., be thought of instead as manifestations of the same underlying problem, with psychedelics targeting that root cause?
Well, I have a couple of responses. First, what would be that underlying root cause? Is it because of kind of pathological rigidity among the different circuits in the brain, which are then relaxed under the influence of psychedelics? Could be, but I think, is there an underlying disorder to all neuropsychiatric, or an underlying mechanism to all neuropsychiatric conditions? I can't really see that, or if there were, I think it's going to be a long time before we discover it. People are much more complex than that. There could be psychological problems, biological problems. I think to the extent that neuroplasticity, neurogenesis plays a role, that could be perhaps a common denominator in the mechanism of action. But whether that implies that the cause is a lack of neuroplasticity or neurogenesis, I don't think we're quite there yet.
So one thing you mentioned was, critiquing the Johns Hopkins group and their use of challenging experiences instead of adverse effects, for example. But it seems like something that we've talked about a lot today and with earlier speakers is this notion of interpretation. So perhaps using challenging experiences allows someone to, interpret it positively later on, still take some type of meaning, some type of therapeutic effect from it, and to label it necessarily as an adverse effect. Do you think that would almost push things in the other direction, where someone takes something challenging and then, has worse outcomes because they think of it as adverse rather than something that they can interpret how they would like?
Well, not really. I think, if you speak with these integration therapists, and they, they're, working with, people in the field, and people, that have a bad trip are ashamed of their experience. Like, what's the matter with me, that I'm still anxious, or I'm still depressed, I'm suicidal after my psychedelic experience. I thought these were just, challenging experiences, and darn, is this challenging, or what's the matter with me? So I think challenging experiences may prevent people from getting help who could use help, because of the reframing as, oh, if I just hang in there, it'll be positive. You also have to keep in mind, how was that scale developed? Well, it was developed by surveys, and who volunteers for survey studies? Well, people that are still together enough to answer a survey and are willing to answer on a survey. So you're excluding a whole slew of people who may have some adverse effects, and they're just too adverse, they're just disgusted, or they're too frightened to respond to the survey. So I don't think we need to invent new terms for negative reactions to drugs. We have a long literature, a long history. I think by calling these adverse effects, which are adverse. I mean, you feel bad. Like, would you call a skin response to penicillin an adverse effect? Or would you call it a challenging experience? Take your pick. Would you call a cardiac arrest after getting a antiarrhythmic drug a challenging experience or an adverse effect? I don't think we need to invent a new vocabulary. The vocabulary is already there.
Thank you. Yeah, so you've discussed this extensively, but substantial resources are being devoted to the development of these non-hallucinogenic, non-psychedelic psychedelics, and with the argument that they're reducing costs associated with going to the clinical setting, as well as avoiding risks associated with the subjective effects that you see in some patient populations. But others argue that this is a bioreductive approach to treatment, where mental health is conceived of in terms of brain states and chemical processes alone, rather than in terms of a personal, lived experience and the meaning that can come from these human-to-human therapeutic encounters. So could you just share a little bit more on this debate and what you think about the other side of the bioreductive approach to treatment, and how some want to kind of push back against that?
Well, that's an argument that's been made forever. I mean, Thomas, Zaz, R.D. Lang, people who say that drugs are bad because, or psychiatric drugs are bad because they don't deal with the whole person. That's kind of an old trope. The first day I was working in the psychiatric emergency room at UC Davis in Sacramento, I was on with the chief resident, and he said, "Oh, I've got this really psychotic guy in the seclusion room." And I said, "Oh, you're gonna give him drugs? You're gonna give him Haldol? I mean, he's having a spiritual emergency." And so I walked into the room, and the guy almost bit my head off. I mean, that kind of changed my point of view instantly. It was a meaningful experience, without psychedelics. I don't think anybody is, saying that just give these non-psychedelic, drugs and that's that. Nobody is, saying that. They're saying that, if you don't want to trip, these drugs might be as effective or almost as effective. And when you give antidepressants, you combine them with, psychotherapy if you want the optimal outcome. You're directing the psychoplastigenic effects in a positive direction. If you are proposing that the acute subjective effects of psychedelics play a role, you can't ignore the biology. You can't just say it's just the psychology that is causing the benefit. I think it's a combination. So I think what is going to end up being the case is in people who want to have a psychedelic experience for their depression, that the outcome may differ in those who don't want a psychedelic experience but still want the biological benefits. So I think the combination of a psychotherapeutic approach and the biological approach is going to be optimal, and that's the case within psychiatry from top to bottom.
Thank you. And then one more question, because we're nearing the end here. What effects do you think psychedelics going mainstream will have on religiosity and skepticism in society?
Skepticism about what?
Religion. So kind of on both sides of the scale.
Oh, I see. You mean will people start believing in God that didn't believe in God before?
Yeah, well, or the other way around.
Yeah, or it can go both ways. Yeah, one of my volunteers was a devout Roman Catholic, and on his big DMT experience, he said, "I'm wrong. There is no God. All this is just bogus." So yeah. It's the set and the setting. If you want to believe in God, but you're not quite sure God exists, and you take a psychedelic, you now believe God exists. If you don't believe, if you and it goes both ways. Like we were saying, if you do believe God exists, but you're not quite sure, and maybe it's just a scam, then it isn't that you're only working on what's conscious. Stan Groff a few years back described psychedelics as non-specific amplifiers of the unconscious. But I think they're non-specific amplifiers of things which are more or less conscious. So that includes the subconscious, the preconscious, and the unconscious. You may not know that you believe or feel a certain thing, but then on psychedelics you do, and you're convinced of their truth in a way that you weren't before. So I think the whole notion of psychedelics changing your mind is a bit simplistic. I mean, you've already got the raw material for making different decisions about things which are impactful for you, and then they're more clear. For example, Francis Crick visualized the double helix on LSD. I wouldn't have back then, and as a result, he discovered the structure of DNA. So it was in the back of his mind. It was preconscious, semi-conscious, unconscious. But it occurred in Francis Crick's, in the mind of Francis Crick. So it's very, these effects are psychedelic. They're 100% specific to who you are. I don't think they contain anything other than being a tool to do various things.
Great. Well, thank you so much. Do you have any final thoughts that you'd like to share to everyone in the symposium?
Well, I think it's good to be skeptical of anything that is, too good to be true. You know how the saying goes: if it is, too good to be true, it's, too good to be true. So I think when you see, papers like psychedelics, mystical experience, and pro-environmental behaviors, you have to look carefully into both the data, and you have to question the motivation and the the bias of the people writing those those kinds of articles.
Great. Well, thank you so much, Dr. Strassman, for this fantastic discussion. Really some critical debates that are going on in the field right now. So thank you for giving us all a lot to think about, a lot to consider. So we can't thank you enough for your time. And thank you all for coming to the symposium. We really appreciate it. And to bring the symposium to a close, I'll now hand it over to my colleague, Matthew, who's going to share some final remarks. So please take it away, Matthew.
Thank you, Anousheh. And thank you again, Dr. Strassman, for taking time out of your schedule to share your knowledge and research with us. As Anousheh said, you brought forward some excellent points to a controversial conversation within the field, and I'm sure is going to continue as we learn how we can best practice going forward in the psychedelic approach. As Anousheh said, my name is Matthew Steed. I wanted to take a few moments on behalf of Students for Sensible Drug Policy to thank you all for being part of a compelling conversation about the future of psychedelic decriminalization, research, and therapy. We truly appreciate the level of engagement and respect for such nuanced topics today. Conversations such as this are extremely important in beginning to jumpstart essential areas of inquiry into what the future of society will look like with the inclusion of psychedelics. While we as a society have a long way to go in determining an effective and inclusive framework, I hope that the topics covered here today instill an inquisitiveness about how we can conduct ourselves more equitably as researchers, students, teachers, and therapists in this blossoming field. Please don't forget to check out our published link tree for additional resources pertaining to our speakers and how to get involved. While there, you can learn more about SSDP's psychedelic pipeline. It's a wonderful way to get involved in the field and get connected with like minds and mentors in order to set yourself on the fast track for internships and other experiential opportunities. In addition, feel free to check out our team page to learn a little bit more about the committee behind creating this event. Again, thank you to our speakers and attendees. We look forward to future events in which we can foster continued discourse about important topics in an effort to be part of change as we go forward in this field.
Thank you all for coming. We really appreciate it.